My name is Joseph Crowfeather, and I am 87 years old. I am the last keeper of a secret that my people, the Quinault Nation, have guarded for over 3 centuries. What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you think you know about the ancient inhabitants of the Pacific Northwest, about the relationship between my ancestors and the creatures you call Bigfoot, and about a covenant that has protected both our peoples for generations. The federal government has spent decades trying to uncover this truth, offering bribes, making threats, even attempting to relocate our entire reservation. But now, as I feel the weight of my years and see the destruction closing in around our sacred lands, I know the time has come to speak. This secret has been passed down through 7 generations of my family, and if I die without sharing it, a bond older than written history will die with me. Before that, I continue. Subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. I was born in 1937 on the Quinault Reservation in Washington State, in a small cedar house that my great-grandfather built with his own hands near the shores of Lake Quinault. The reservation sits in the heart of the Olympic Peninsula, surrounded by some of the last remaining temperate rainforest in North America. Ancient Sitka spruces tower 300 feet above the forest floor, their trunks so massive that 20 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. The air is thick with moisture, and the rich scent of cedar, hemlock, and the eternal cycle of growth and decay that defines this ecosystem. My grandfather, William Crowfeather, was the tribal historian and medicine man, a keeper of the old ways in a world that was rapidly changing around us. He spoke fluent Quinault, English, and what he called the old tongue, a language he claimed was older than any human speech. As a child, I thought this was just another of his stories, the kind of mystical tales that elders tell to keep children entertained and connected to their heritage. I was wrong about many things in those days. Our reservation was different from others I would later visit. While most native communities struggled with poverty and the ongoing effects of colonization, we seemed to thrive in ways that puzzled government officials and anthropologists. Our forests were healthier, our salmon runs more abundant, our people less affected by the diseases and social problems that plagued other tribes. Visitors would comment on the unusual prosperity of our community, the way our children seemed more connected to the land, the strange abundance of wildlife in our territory. What they didn't know was that we weren't managing these resources alone. My first glimpse of the truth came when I was 12 years old, during the winter of 1949. I had been out checking trap lines with my grandfather, following trails that wound deep into the old-growth forest, where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. We were several miles from the nearest road, in country so remote that even experienced hunters rarely ventured there. It was snowing heavily, the kind of wet, heavy snow that turns the forest into a cathedral of white silence. My grandfather had stopped to examine some tracks in the snow, prints that looked almost human, but were far too large, with a stride length that suggested something much taller than any person I'd ever seen. "Grandfather," I whispered, pointing at the tracks, "what animal made these?" He looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he cupped his hands around his mouth and made a sound I had never heard before, a low, haunting call that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising and falling like the wind through the trees. The response came from somewhere in the forest ahead of us, a similar call but deeper, more resonant, carrying undertones that made my bones vibrate. My grandfather smiled and began following the tracks, motioning for me to stay close behind him. We walked for another hour through the falling snow, following a trail that led deeper into the heart of the forest. The tracks were joined by others, smaller prints that suggested a family group, all moving in the same direction, with the purposeful gait of creatures who knew exactly where they were going. When we finally reached our destination, I thought at first that we had stumbled upon some kind of natural amphitheater. We stood at the edge of a circular clearing, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by ancient cedars whose trunks formed natural walls. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the canopy, I realized that this was no accident of nature. The clearing had been deliberately shaped. The undergrowth carefully managed to create open spaces while preserving the largest trees. Fallen logs had been arranged to form seating areas around a central fire pit where coals still glowed red against the snow, and moving through this space with quiet purpose were creatures that shouldn't have existed. They were enormous. The smallest stood at least 7 feet tall, while the largest towered over 9 feet. Their bodies were covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb the falling snow, and they moved with a grace that belied their massive size. But it was their faces that stopped my heart. Beneath heavy brow ridges and broad, flat noses, their eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably conscious. They were not animals, they were people. My grandfather placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Joseph, meet our oldest allies, the Siatko, the ancient ones, the first people of this land. Your great-great-grandmother called them family." What followed was the most extraordinary hour of my young life. My grandfather approached the group with the easy familiarity of someone visiting old friends, and they welcomed him with vocalizations that I slowly realized were a form of language. Complex, tonal, filled with nuances that human vocal cords could barely reproduce, but definitely communication between intelligent beings. The largest of the creatures, clearly the elder of the group, approached me with careful, deliberate movements. He crouched down to bring his massive head closer to my level, and when he looked into my eyes, I felt a connection that transcended species, transcended everything I thought I knew about the world. He spoke to my grandfather in that strange musical language, and my grandfather responded in kind. They were talking about me, I realized, discussing something important. Finally, my grandfather turned to me with an expression more serious than I had ever seen. "Joseph, this is Chief Standing Bear, standing. He is asking if you are ready to learn the true history of our people, to understand the covenant that has protected both our tribes for 300 years. But once you know this truth, you can never unknow it. You will become a keeper of secrets that could change the world, and that responsibility will follow you for the rest of your life." I was 12 years old, standing in a hidden clearing in the middle of a snowstorm, face to face with creatures that science said didn't exist. The smart thing would have been to run, to pretend this was all a dream, to go back to my normal life and forget what I had seen. Instead, I nodded. What Chief Standing Bear told me that day, translated through my grandfather's careful interpretation, was a history that no textbook would ever contain. The Siatko were not some unknown species of ape or missing link in human evolution. They were the original inhabitants of the Pacific Northwest, a people who had achieved consciousness and civilization long before humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge. They had cities once, built into the living rock of mountain caves and hidden valleys. They had agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and an understanding of the natural world that made human science look primitive. But they had also learned something that humans never had, the importance of balance. When they realized that their expansion was damaging the ecosystem they depended on, they made a collective decision that would define their culture for millennia. They chose to step back, to live in harmony with the natural world rather than domination over it. They dismantled their cities, abandoned their agriculture, and became guardians of the wilderness instead of its conquerors. But this choice came with a price. When humans arrived and began the process of expansion and exploitation that the Siatko had rejected, they found themselves pushed to the margins, forced to hide in the deepest forests and most remote mountains. They watched as their sacred sites were destroyed, their food sources depleted, their territory carved up and sold to the highest bidder. That's when they made contact with my ancestors. The first meeting happened in 1692, during one of the harshest winters in tribal memory. A group of Kino hunters, starving and lost in a blizzard, stumbled into a Siatko settlement. Instead of hiding or driving the humans away, the Siatko chose to help. They shared their food, their shelter, their knowledge of survival in the harsh mountain environment. But more than that, they shared their wisdom. The Siatko taught my ancestors about sustainable hunting practices, about which plants could heal and which could harm, about the complex relationships between all living things in the forest ecosystem. They showed them how to read weather patterns weeks in advance, how to find water in the driest seasons, how to move through the forest without leaving a trace. In return, my ancestors offered something the Siatko desperately needed: protection from the outside world. As European settlers began arriving in larger numbers, the Siatko found themselves increasingly threatened by human expansion. But the Kino, with their growing knowledge of both worlds, could serve as intermediaries. They could warn the Siatko of approaching danger, could misdirect explorers and hunters away from sensitive areas, could use their status as a recognized tribe to create legal barriers to development in crucial habitats. The covenant was formalized in a ceremony that combined elements of both cultures, held in a sacred grove that still exists today, hidden deep in the Olympic Mountains. The Kinol would protect the Siatko's existence and territory, and in return, the Siatko would share their knowledge and help maintain the health of the ecosystem that both peoples depended on. For over 3 centuries, this partnership has worked exactly as intended. The unusual prosperity of the Kinol Reservation, the abundance of wildlife in our territory, the health of our forests, all of this was the result of management practices developed through collaboration with the Siatko. They taught us which areas to harvest and which to leave untouched, how to encourage the growth of salmon runs, how to maintain the delicate balance that keeps a temperate rainforest healthy. But the partnership went deeper than environmental management. The Siatko became our teachers, our guides, our friends. Quinault children, who showed particular aptitude for traditional ways, were sometimes chosen to spend time with Siatko families, learning skills and perspectives that no human education could provide. Siatko young people would visit our communities, observing human culture and technology, helping their elders understand the changing world around them. I was one of those chosen children. From the age of 12, I spent part of each year living with Chief Standing Bear's family in their hidden settlement deep in the Olympic Mountains. The experience was unlike anything I could have imagined. The Siatko lived in structures that seemed to grow from the forest itself, dwellings carved into living trees, shaped from stone and earth, designed to be invisible from above, while providing all the comfort and functionality their inhabitants needed. Their technology was based on principles that human science was only beginning to understand. They could predict earthquakes days in advance by reading subtle changes in animal behavior and ground vibration. They had medicines derived from plants that could heal injuries and illnesses that would have been fatal to humans. They could communicate across vast distances using a combination of vocalizations, scent markers, and what I can only describe as a form of telepathic connection that linked all members of their community. But perhaps most remarkably, they had achieved something that human civilization has always struggled with: true sustainability. Their population had remained stable for thousands of years, not through restriction or scarcity, but through a deep understanding of their place in the larger ecosystem. They took only what they needed, gave back more than they consumed, and lived in a way that actually improved the health of their environment. Chief Standing Bear became like a second grandfather to me, teaching me skills that no human possessed. He showed me how to move through the forest so silently that I could approach deer without them noticing, how to read the subtle signs that indicated weather changes days in advance, how to find food and medicine in plants that most people would consider weeds. But more than practical skills, he taught me about perspective. The Siatko viewed time differently than humans, thinking in terms of centuries rather than years, considering the impact of every action on the 7th generation yet to come. They saw themselves not as separate from nature, but as part of it with responsibilities as well as rights. "Your people think in straight lines," Chief Standing Bear once told me, his words translated through the mixture of Siatko language, Kinol, and English that we used to communicate. Birth to death, cause to effect, problem to solution. But the world moves in circles, everything is connected to everything else. When you understand this, you understand how to live without destroying. I spent 15 years learning from the Siatko, visiting their communities, participating in their ceremonies, becoming fluent in their language and their ways of thinking. By the time I was 27, I was one of only 3 humans who had been fully initiated into their society, granted the knowledge and responsibility that came with being a bridge between worlds. That's when everything began to change. The 1960s brought new pressures to the Pacific Northwest. Environmental awareness was growing, but so was development pressure. Logging companies were using new technologies to clear-cut forests at unprecedented rates. The federal government was building dams that disrupted salmon runs. Urban sprawl was pushing deeper into previously untouched wilderness areas. Worse, there were signs that the Siatko's existence was becoming known to the outside world. In 1967, the famous Patterson-Gimlin film was shot less than 50 miles from one of the Siatko settlements I knew well. The creature in that film was a young Siatko male named Running Wolf, who had been caught off guard while foraging and had panicked when he saw the humans with their camera. The film caused a sensation, launching a wave of Bigfoot hunters and researchers that brought unprecedented attention to the Olympic Peninsula. The Siatko were terrified. For 3 centuries they had managed to remain hidden, to exist in the spaces between human knowledge and human fear. But now their image was being broadcast around the world, and every amateur cryptozoologist with a camera was heading to their territory. Chief Standing Bear called an emergency council that included the elders from all the remaining Siatko communities. There were only 4 settlements left, with a total population of fewer than 200 individuals. The debate that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed in my years with them. Some argued for complete withdrawal, for abandoning their traditional territories and retreating to the most remote areas of Alaska or Canada. Others wanted to make formal contact with human authorities, hoping that official recognition might provide protection. A few of the younger Siatko advocated for more aggressive action, using their superior knowledge of the forest to drive away the increasing number of human intruders. The decision they reached was both brilliant and heartbreaking. They would use the growing Bigfoot mythology to hide in plain sight. Instead of avoiding human contact entirely, they would carefully orchestrate encounters that would feed the legend while discrediting serious research. They would allow themselves to be seen just often enough to maintain interest, but always in ways that could be dismissed as hoaxes or misidentification. Blurry photographs, questionable footprints, contradictory eyewitness accounts, all designed to keep the truth buried under layers of sensationalism and skepticism. My role in this deception was crucial. As a member of the Quinault tribe with legitimate reasons to be in the forest, I could guide researchers away from sensitive areas, provide false information about Siatko habits and territories, and generally ensure that serious scientific study remained impossible. For 30 years, I helped perpetuate the myth of Bigfoot while protecting the reality of the Siatko. I led countless expeditions into the Olympic Mountains, always careful to avoid the areas where I knew Siatko families lived. I shared stories that contained just enough truth to be believable while omitting the crucial details that would have led to actual discovery. I became known as one of the most knowledgeable Bigfoot researchers in the Pacific Northwest, all while working to ensure that the research would never succeed. The irony was bitter. I was protecting the Siatko by helping to turn them into a joke, a subject for tabloid headlines and reality television shows. Every fake footprint I helped create, every staged encounter I facilitated, every piece of false evidence I planted, all of it was designed to discredit the very real, very intelligent people I had come to love as family. But the strategy worked. As Bigfoot became more famous, serious scientific interest actually decreased. The subject became so associated with hoaxes and charlatans that legitimate researchers avoided it entirely, afraid of damaging their careers. The Siatko achieved the perfect camouflage, hiding in the bright light of public attention. However, this protection came at a terrible cost. The constant need for secrecy, the stress of living under threat of discovery, the gradual loss of their traditional territories to development, all of this took a toll on Siatko society. Their population began to decline, not through violence or disease, but through a kind of cultural exhaustion. Young Siatko, seeing the vibrant human world beyond the forest, began to question whether a life of hiding was worth preserving. Some left entirely, using their intelligence and physical capabilities to blend into human society. With careful grooming and clothing, a Siatko could pass for an unusually large, hairy human. I know of at least a dozen who found work in remote areas: Alaska fishing boats, Canadian logging camps, isolated ranches in Montana, places where their size and strength were assets, and their antisocial tendencies could be attributed to the harsh environment. Others simply gave up. The Siatko had always had low birth rates, a natural adaptation to their sustainable lifestyle. But as hope for the future diminished, even these low rates began to fall. Families that had existed for thousands of years simply stopped having children, unable to imagine a world where their offspring could live freely. By 1995, the total Siatko population had fallen to fewer than 50 individuals scattered across 3 settlements. Chief Standing Bear, now ancient even by Siatko standards, was one of only 5 elders who remembered the time before the hiding began. The weight of their species' decline was visible in his eyes, a sadness that seemed to encompass centuries of loss. That's when he made a decision that would change everything. He asked me to document their true history. "The world is changing again," he told me during one of our last conversations. "Your people are beginning to understand what we have always known, that the health of the forest and the health of all life are connected. Perhaps it is time for the truth to be known, for our peoples to work together openly instead of in shadow." For 5 years, I worked with the remaining Siatko elders to create a complete record of their history, their culture, their knowledge. We documented their language, their technologies, their understanding of forest ecology and sustainable living. We recorded their stories, their songs, their ceremonies. We mapped their sacred sites, their traditional territories, their migration routes. It was a race against time. The elders were dying, taking irreplaceable knowledge with them. The younger Siatko were losing interest in the old ways, more concerned with survival in the modern world than with preserving ancient traditions. The forests themselves were changing, as climate change and human development altered the ecosystem that had supported Siatko civilization for millennia. Chief Standing Bear died in the winter of 2001, the last of the great elders who had known the Siatko in their full glory. His death marked the end of an era, the final breaking of a chain of knowledge that had stretched back to the beginning of consciousness on this continent, but his legacy lived on in the records we had created together. The documentation we had compiled was unlike anything in human archives. It contained detailed maps of underground water systems that could predict drought years in advance. It included botanical knowledge that could revolutionize medicine and agriculture. It held the keys to sustainable forest management practices that could restore damaged ecosystems and prevent the kind of environmental collapse that threatens the entire Pacific Northwest. Most importantly, it contained proof of the Siatko's intelligence, their humanity, their right to exist as equals rather than subjects of study or exploitation. The question was what to do with this knowledge. The remaining Siatko were divided. Some wanted the records to remain secret, fearing that disclosure would bring the same kind of attention that had driven them into hiding in the first place. Others argued that secrecy had failed, that their species was dying anyway, and that their only hope for survival lay in open cooperation with sympathetic humans. The decision was made for us in 2003, when a logging company began clear-cutting operations in an area that contained one of the last major Siatko settlements. The Siatko had always been able to avoid such conflicts through careful negotiation and the protection of the Quinault tribal government, but this time was different. The logging rights had been sold to a multinational corporation with no local ties and no interest in environmental concerns. They had the legal authority to harvest everything in their designated area, and they intended to do exactly that. The settlement in question was home to the last intact Siatko family group, 12 individuals, ranging from elders to children, living in dwellings that had been occupied continuously for over 1,000 years. They couldn't simply relocate. Their entire way of life was tied to that specific ecosystem, to the plants and animals and water sources that existed nowhere else. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Siatko were forced to choose between exposure and extinction. They chose exposure. The plan we developed was carefully orchestrated to maximize impact while minimizing risk. I would approach Dr. Jane Morrison, a forest ecologist at the University of Washington, who had been studying old-growth ecosystems for decades. Dr. Morrison was known for her environmental activism and her willingness to challenge corporate interests when they threatened sensitive habitats. I contacted her under the pretense of sharing traditional Quinault knowledge about forest management, offering to show her techniques that had been used for centuries to maintain healthy ecosystems. She was intrigued by the possibility of learning indigenous practices that could inform modern conservation efforts. The meeting was arranged for a misty morning in October 2003, in the same clearing where I had first met Chief Standing Bear 54 years earlier. Dr. Morrison arrived expecting to learn about traditional plant harvesting or fire management techniques. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with a family of creatures that science said didn't exist. The introduction was handled with the same careful ceremony that had marked my own first encounter. The Siatko emerged from the forest slowly, deliberately, allowing Dr. Morrison time to process what she was seeing. The family patriarch, a massive individual named Stone Walker, who was Chief Standing Bear's nephew, approached with the same gentle dignity that had characterized all my interactions with his people. Dr. Morrison's reaction was everything we had hoped for. After the initial shock wore off, her scientific training took over. She began asking questions, making observations, trying to understand the implications of what she was witnessing. When Stone Walker demonstrated his intelligence by solving complex problems and communicating through the mixture of vocalizations and gestures that served as a bridge language, her amazement was genuine and profound. But it was when the Siatko children approached her, curious and unafraid, that the full emotional impact hit her. These weren't monsters or missing links or evolutionary curiosities. They were people, intelligent, emotional, creative beings with their own culture and their own right to exist. The documentation session that followed lasted 3 days. Dr. Morrison recorded hours of video showing Siatko individuals demonstrating their intelligence, their technology, their deep knowledge of forest ecology. She collected samples of their tools, their medicines, their art. She interviewed family members through my translation, learning about their history, their culture, their current situation. Most importantly, she documented the threat they faced. The logging operation was scheduled to begin in less than a month, and it would destroy not just the Siatko settlement, but the entire ecosystem that supported it. Ancient trees that had stood for over 1,000 years would be reduced to lumber. Streams that had run clear since the last ice age would be choked with sediment. Plants that existed nowhere else on Earth would be bulldozed into oblivion. Dr. Morrison understood that she was witnessing something unprecedented, the potential extinction of an intelligent species in real time. Her response was immediate and decisive. Within a week of our meeting, she had filed injunctions to halt the logging operation, citing the presence of endangered species and sensitive habitats. She contacted colleagues at major universities, environmental organizations, and government agencies, sharing carefully selected portions of her documentation to build support for protection of the area. But she also understood the delicate nature of the situation. Full disclosure of the Siatko's existence would bring exactly the kind of attention that had driven them into hiding in the first place. Instead, she focused on the environmental arguments, using the Siatko's knowledge to demonstrate the unique ecological value of their habitat, without revealing the source of that knowledge. The legal battle that followed lasted 2 years. The logging company fought the injunctions with teams of lawyers and lobbyists, arguing that environmental concerns were being used to block legitimate economic development. They brought in their own scientists to challenge Dr. Morrison's findings, claiming that the area contained nothing that couldn't be found elsewhere. But Dr. Morrison had something they couldn't counter: the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of careful observation. The Siatko's knowledge of the forest ecosystem was so detailed, so precise, that it revealed connections and relationships that human science had never suspected. Plants that seemed common were actually keystone species, whose removal would trigger cascading ecological collapse. Water sources that appeared insignificant were actually crucial to the survival of endangered salmon runs. Areas that looked like ordinary forest were actually complex, managed ecosystems that had been maintained through subtle intervention for centuries. The case became a landmark in environmental law, establishing new precedents for the protection of indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological practices. More importantly, it worked. The logging operation was permanently halted, and the area was designated as a protected research preserve under joint management by the University of Washington and the Kino Nation. The Siatko settlement was safe, at least for the moment, but the victory came with complications. The legal proceedings had attracted attention from researchers, government agencies, and environmental groups around the world. The area was now under constant scrutiny, making it impossible for the Siatko to maintain their traditional way of life. Worse, the success of the environmental arguments had created pressure to expand the research, to document more of the traditional knowledge that had proven so valuable in court. Dr. Morrison found herself fielding requests from dozens of scientists who wanted to study Quino forest management practices, unaware that those practices were actually the result of collaboration with a species they didn't know existed. The Siatko were trapped in a new kind of hiding, protected from immediate destruction, but unable to live freely in their own territory. That's when Stonewalker made a decision that shocked everyone, including me. He wanted to make his people's existence known to the world. The debate that followed was the most intense I had ever witnessed in Siatko society. For hours, the family argued in their complex musical language about the risks and benefits of revelation. The elders feared that exposure would bring the same kind of exploitation and violence that had driven them into hiding in the first place. The younger Siatko argued that secrecy had failed, that their species was dying in isolation, and that their only hope lay in finding allies among sympathetic humans. Stonewalker's argument was both practical and philosophical. The world was changing rapidly, he pointed out. Climate change was altering the forest ecosystem in ways that threatened all life in the region. Human technology was becoming so sophisticated that hiding would soon be impossible anyway. And most importantly, the knowledge his people possessed about sustainability, about living in harmony with the natural world, about the connections between all living things, was exactly what humanity needed to address the environmental crisis that threatened the entire planet. "We have spent 3 centuries protecting ourselves by hiding from your people," he said to me during one of our private conversations. "But perhaps it is time to protect your people by sharing with them. The forest is dying. The salmon are disappearing. The climate is changing in ways that will make this land uninhabitable for all of us. We have knowledge that could help, but only if we are free to share it openly." The decision was made by consensus, as all important SEATCO decisions were. They would reveal themselves to the world, but carefully, through controlled contact with selected individuals who had already proven their trustworthiness and their commitment to environmental protection. Dr. Morrison was the obvious choice for first contact, but she was not alone. Over the following months, Stonewalker's family made contact with a carefully chosen group of scientists, environmental activists, and Indigenous rights advocates. Each contact was documented, each interaction recorded, building an undeniable body of evidence for the SEATCO's intelligence and their right to protection. The response was everything we had hoped for, and everything we had feared. The scientists were amazed by the SEATCO's knowledge and eager to learn from them. Environmental groups rallied to their cause, seeing them as the ultimate Indigenous people whose rights had been violated for centuries. Indigenous rights advocates recognized them as kindred spirits in the struggle for recognition and self-determination, but there were also those who saw the SEATCO as opportunities for exploitation. Government agencies wanted to study them, to understand their capabilities, to determine whether they posed any kind of threat. Corporations saw potential profits in their knowledge, their strength, their unique abilities. Media outlets sensationalized their existence, turning them into celebrities rather than people. Most dangerously, there were those who saw them as threats to be eliminated. The first attack came in the spring of 2006, when a group of armed men calling themselves human purists attempted to assault the SEATCO settlement. They were stopped by a combination of Kino tribal police and the SEATCO's own defensive capabilities. It's hard to mount a successful attack against people who know every tree, every rock, every hiding place in a 1,000-square-mile area. But the message was clear. Not all humans were ready to accept the existence of another intelligent species. The federal government's response was more subtle, but equally concerning. They offered protection in exchange for cooperation, wanting to relocate the SEATCO to a secure facility where they could be studied and their safety guaranteed. When the SEATCO refused, pointing out that such facilities were indistinguishable from prisons, the government began applying pressure through regulatory agencies and legal challenges. Suddenly, the protected status of the SEATCO's territory was under review. Environmental permits were being reconsidered. The joint management agreement between the university and the Kino Nation was being challenged in court. It became clear that the government was willing to use any means necessary to gain control over the SEATCO and their knowledge. That's when I made the most difficult decision of my life. I decided to go public with the full truth. The documentation I had compiled with Chief Standing Bear and the other elders was more than just an academic record. It was proof of the SEATCO's intelligence, their history, their right to exist as free people rather than subjects of study. More importantly, it contained their knowledge about sustainable living, about forest ecology, about the connections between all life on Earth, knowledge that could help humanity address the environmental crisis that threatened our planet's future. But releasing this information would also expose the SEATCO to unprecedented scrutiny and potential exploitation. It would end their ability to control their own narrative, to choose who they trusted with their secrets. It would make them the most famous and most vulnerable people on Earth. Stonewalker and his family understood the risks, but they also understood the alternatives. Their species was dying anyway, slowly but surely, as their habitat disappeared and their population dwindled. At least this way, their knowledge would survive even if they didn't. The release was coordinated through Dr. Morrison and her network of colleagues, ensuring that the information reached legitimate scientists and environmental organizations before it could be sensationalized or distorted by less scrupulous outlets. The documentation was comprehensive. Video recordings, audio files, photographs, detailed maps, botanical samples, linguistic analyses, and historical accounts that painted a complete picture of SEATCO civilization. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, the SEATCO settlement was surrounded by researchers, journalists, government officials, and curiosity seekers. The careful isolation that had protected them for centuries was shattered in an instant. Stonewalker's family found themselves the most famous people on Earth. their every movement documented and analyzed by a world hungry for information about these newly discovered neighbors. But fame, we quickly learned, was not the same as acceptance. While many people were fascinated by the Siatko and eager to learn from them, others saw them as threats to human supremacy, to religious beliefs, to the comfortable assumption that intelligence was a uniquely human trait. Protests erupted outside the settlement, with some groups demanding that the Siatko be granted full human rights, while others insisted they be contained or eliminated. The government's response was to declare the entire area a national security zone, effectively placing the Siatko under federal protection that was indistinguishable from federal custody. They were safe from attack, but they were also prisoners in their own territory, unable to travel freely or interact with the outside world without government supervision. The irony was bitter. After 3 centuries of hiding from human society, the Siatko had finally revealed themselves in the hope of finding acceptance and cooperation. Instead, they found themselves more isolated than ever, protected by the same government that sought to control and study them. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The knowledge they shared revolutionized human understanding of forest ecology, sustainable agriculture, and environmental management. Techniques that the Siatko had used for thousands of years were adapted for use in reforestation projects, watershed management, and climate change mitigation efforts around the world. Their understanding of plant medicine led to breakthroughs in treating diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. More importantly, their existence changed the way humans thought about intelligence, consciousness, and our place in the natural world. The discovery that we shared the planet with another intelligent species forced a fundamental re-evaluation of human exceptionalism and our relationship with the environment. Universities established new departments dedicated to studying Siatko knowledge and its applications. Environmental organizations used their example to argue for more comprehensive protection of wilderness areas. Indigenous rights groups pointed to their treatment as evidence of the need for better recognition and protection of all native peoples. But for Stonewalker and his family, these abstract benefits provided little comfort. They remained confined to their protected territory, allowed limited contact with the outside world, their every interaction monitored and recorded by government officials who claimed to be acting in their best interests. The stress of this existence took its toll. Within 5 years of going public, 3 members of Stonewalker's family had died, not from violence or disease, but from what can only be described as heartbreak, the loss of freedom, the constant scrutiny, the inability to live according to their traditional ways. All of this proved more devastating than centuries of hiding had ever been. By 2015, only 4 Siatko remained in the settlement. Stonewalker himself, now ancient and frail, his daughter Morning Mist, who had become the reluctant spokesperson for her people, and 2 young adults who had never known life outside the protected zone. It was then that Morning Mist made a decision that surprised everyone. She announced that she was leaving the settlement to live among humans. The government officials were horrified. They had spent nearly a decade building security protocols around the assumption that the Siatko would remain in their designated territory. The idea that one of them might simply walk away, might disappear into human society, challenged everything they thought they understood about the situation. But Morning Mist was determined. She had watched her people die in captivity, had seen their culture reduced to a subject of academic study, had witnessed the slow extinction of everything that made Siatko life meaningful. She would rather take her chances in the human world than continue living as a protected specimen. Her departure was carefully planned and executed with the help of sympathetic researchers and indigenous rights advocates. Using techniques her ancestors had developed for blending into human society, she disappeared into the vast anonymity of modern America, leaving behind only a message for those who would try to find her. We came out of hiding to share our knowledge and find acceptance among your people. Instead, we found a different kind of prison, more comfortable but no less confining than the forests where we hid for centuries. I choose freedom over safety, uncertainty over control. If my people are to survive, it will not be as curiosities in a government preserve, but as individuals making their own choices about how to live in your world. The search for Morning Mist lasted 2 years and involved resources from multiple federal agencies. They never found her. Somewhere in America, a member of the world's most famous endangered species was living anonymously among humans, and all the technology and expertise of the modern surveillance state couldn't locate her. Her escape changed everything. The remaining Siatko in the settlement were subjected to increased security measures, but the damage was done. The myth of government control had been shattered, and the world now knew that these intelligent beings could not be contained against their will. More importantly, Morning Mist's message had resonated with people around the world who saw parallels between the Siatko's situation and the struggles of indigenous peoples everywhere. Pressure mounted for a new approach to Siatko relations, one based on recognition of their rights rather than management of their existence. Environmental groups, indigenous rights organizations, and civil liberties advocates formed a coalition demanding that the Siatko be granted full legal status as a sovereign people with the right to self-determination. The breakthrough came in 2018, when the United Nations formally recognized the Siatko as an indigenous people with rights under international law. The decision was largely symbolic. The UN had no power to enforce its rulings against the United States government, but it provided a legal framework for challenging the federal custody arrangement. More importantly, it gave the remaining Siatko something they had lost: hope. Stonewalker, now the last of the great elders, lived to see his people recognized as equals rather than subjects. He died peacefully in the winter of 2019, surrounded by the few family members who remained and the human friends who had fought for his people's rights. His last words, translated through the mixture of languages we had used for so many years, were a message of gratitude and hope. Tell your people that we forgive them for the fear that drove them to cage us. Tell them that we understand the difficulty of accepting that consciousness takes many forms. Tell them that our knowledge is their knowledge now, our wisdom, their inheritance. Tell them to use it well, to heal the wounds that have been made in the earth, to find the balance that we sought for so long. Tell them that intelligence is not a competition, but a collaboration, and that the future belongs to those who learn to work together rather than apart. Today, in 2024, only 2 Siatko remain in the protected settlement: Stonewalker's great-nephew, a young adult named River Song, and an elderly female named Quiet Water, who is the last keeper of certain traditional songs and stories. They live under a new arrangement that grants them more freedom while still providing protection, but they remain the last visible representatives of a people who once numbered in the thousands. But they are not the last Siatko. Morning Mist's escape proved that members of her species could survive and even thrive in human society if they chose to do so. Intelligence networks suggest that there may be as many as a dozen Siatko living anonymously among humans, using their superior intelligence and physical capabilities to build successful lives while hiding their true nature. There are rumors of a Siatko working as a wilderness guide in Alaska, of another serving as a forest firefighter in California, of a third who has become a successful environmental consultant in the Pacific Northwest. These individuals have chosen integration over isolation, freedom over safety, and their success suggests that coexistence between the species may be possible after all. The knowledge they shared has already begun to transform human understanding of sustainable living and environmental management. Reforestation projects based on Siatko techniques are restoring damaged ecosystems around the world. Agricultural methods inspired by their practices are increasing crop yields while reducing environmental impact. Medical treatments derived from their plant knowledge are saving lives and alleviating suffering. But perhaps most importantly, their existence has changed the way humans think about intelligence, consciousness, and our place in the natural world. The discovery that we share the planet with another sapient species has forced a fundamental re-evaluation of human exceptionalism and our relationship with the environment. Schools now teach about the Siatko alongside other indigenous peoples, emphasizing their contributions to human knowledge and their right to exist as equals. Environmental organizations use their example to argue for more comprehensive protection of wilderness areas and the species that depend on them. Scientists study their sustainable practices as models for addressing climate change and environmental degradation. The covenant that my ancestors made with the Siatko 3 centuries ago has evolved into something larger and more complex than either species could have imagined. What began as a simple agreement between neighbors has become a template for interspecies cooperation, a proof of concept for the kind of collaboration that may be necessary for both our peoples to survive the challenges of the modern world. But the story is far from over. Climate change continues to alter the ecosystems that both species depend on, forcing new adaptations and new forms of cooperation. Human technology advances at a pace that makes traditional forms of hiding increasingly difficult. while also creating new opportunities for communication and collaboration. The younger generation of both species grows up with a different understanding of what is possible, less constrained by the fears and assumptions that shaped their elders. I am 87 years old now, the last human keeper of the original covenant, the final bridge between the world that was and the world that is becoming. The knowledge I have carried for 7 decades, the languages, the histories, the secrets that shape the relationship between our peoples, will die with me unless I pass it on to a new generation of guardians. That is why I am telling this story now, despite the risks, despite the agreements I have signed, despite the threats I have received. The world needs to know that intelligence takes many forms, that consciousness is not limited to human experience, that we share this planet with beings whose wisdom and perspective could help us solve the challenges that threaten all life on Earth. The government will deny this story, of course. They will claim it's fiction, fantasy, the delusions of an old man living in the past. They will point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of peer-reviewed studies, the convenient deaths of key witnesses. They will do everything in their power to maintain the fiction that the Sayatko are safely contained, that their knowledge is being properly managed, that the situation is under control. But I have seen the truth, lived with it for 75 years, and I will not take it to my grave. Somewhere in the mountains of Washington state, in a protected valley surrounded by ancient trees and federal agents, the last visible representatives of Earth's first intelligent species continue their quiet existence. They tend their gardens, preserve their stories, and maintain the hope that someday, somehow, their people and mine might learn to share this world in peace. Somewhere in America, hidden among 7 billion humans, other members of their species have chosen a different path. They work and live and love alongside us, their true nature known only to themselves, their contributions to human society unrecognized but real. And somewhere in the future, in a world shaped by the knowledge they shared and the example they set, perhaps both our species will find the wisdom to live in harmony with each other and with the natural world that sustains us all. The covenant continues, evolved and expanded beyond anything my ancestors could have imagined. What began as a simple agreement between neighbors has become a template for the kind of cooperation that may be necessary for all intelligent life to survive and thrive on this small, fragile planet we call home. The Sayatko taught us that intelligence is not a competition, but a collaboration, that consciousness is not a privilege, but a responsibility, that wisdom comes not from domination, but from understanding our place in the larger web of life that connects all things. These are the lessons they offer to humanity, the gifts they have given to our species, despite the fear and misunderstanding they have faced. Whether we are wise enough to accept these gifts, to learn from their example, to build the kind of world where all forms of consciousness can flourish, that remains to be seen. But I have hope. I have seen what is possible when different species choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, love over hate. I have witnessed the birth of a new kind of relationship between intelligent beings, one based on mutual respect and shared responsibility for the world we all inhabit. The story I have told you is true, every word of it. I have the scars, the memories, and the sacred objects to prove it. But more than that, I have the certainty that comes from 75 years of friendship with beings whose existence challenges everything we think we know about life, consciousness, and our place in the universe. The covenant between the Quinault and the Sayatko was forged in secrecy and maintained through sacrifice, but its ultimate purpose was always to preserve the possibility of a better future for both our peoples. That future is not guaranteed, but it is possible, and it depends on the choices we make about how we treat the other intelligences that share this world with us. The forest is listening. The Sayatko are watching, and somewhere in the vast complexity of modern human society, members of both our species are working together to build the kind of world where consciousness, in all its forms, can flourish. That is their gift to us. That is their challenge to us. That is their hope for us. Don't let them wait in vain. If you made it this far, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps stories like this continue to be told.